Okay, we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, but I'm going to do a whole overview of the whole thing and then focus on the autonomic nervous system. All right, so to get us started, I want to draw first the central nervous system. We know the central nervous system is just the brain and spinal cord. Yes, this is a wonky brain and spinal cord, but with my artistic ability, that's the best I can do. All right, so I'm going to do now the peripheral nervous system, and I'm going to do sensory on one side and motor on the other. Be aware that it's on both sides, but this is just for diagram purposes. All right, what's a good color for sensory? This is a good one. Okay, so we're going to put sensory over here. So this is going to be sensory, and we know that is afferent. So the sensory part of the nervous system, this is it. This is the whole thing, okay? All right, so the neurons, let's make this blue too. So we know that the sensory part or afferent part are fibers that run into the central nervous system. These are unipolar neurons. So their cell bodies will be over here and they'll look like little lollipops. They're located right before they enter that posterior horn. They're located in the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, so this thing here is a dorsal root ganglia. This right here is also a dorsal root ganglia. Dorsal root ganglia. So of course there's going to be more than one, cell body in there, but we're just looking at general here. All right, so up here we have, this is a unipolar neuron, so here's our little dendrites down there that have a receptor. The receptor is going to go to things like your skin, muscle, joints. Okay, so these are going to be things like, senses that we are aware of, like, itch, touch, heat, pain, things going on with your joints, stretch, tension, and it will include the special senses as well, because those are stimuli that we are aware of. So this is called the somatic sensory neuron. Okay, this is the somatic sensory system. And of course, it is going to be conscious. This is conscious awareness of stimuli. Okay, you know about it. All right. So this one down here, let me make this a little bit lighter in blue. So this is going to be similar. It's the same type of neuron, the unipolar neuron, but this neuron is going to come from glands, organs, smooth muscle. So things that we don't know or aren't aware that are getting stimuli and are reacting to it. We have no idea what our heart is doing, from minute to minute, unless you're, running and you feel it beating hard, but you didn't really notice it realizing that it needed to beat hard, So, your liver, your stomach, your intestines, all these things that do a whole bunch of stuff, and you got no idea that it's happening. Okay. This is visceral sensory. And of course, this is going to be in the subconscious, because again, who knows how to spell subconscious, but whatever. Okay, so subconscious, or it's just not in your knowing area. It's not going to be going on in your cerebrum. You're not going to know about it. You don't know. You just ate a meal, your stomach got stretched out, and now it's starting to churn and digest the food in the stomach. But you don't know that it's happening. It's happening, but you're not aware of it. Okay. All right, that is the whole sensory system. So on the other side, I want to do motor, obviously. So motor, and we know that is efferent. These are efferent little pathways here. So there are basically 3 neurons that we deal with here. 3 neuron pathways, however you want to call it. And they start in the spinal cord, where the sensory pathways from the periphery ended in the spinal cord into the posterior horn. The motor pathways start in the spinal cord. Okay, and they start in the spinal cord, in the anterior horn, or in the lateral horn, or in cranial nerves. Okay, cranial nerves in the sacral area. All right, so on this one, we have a neuron that is, its cell body is in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and it comes out, 1 neuron, and it goes to skeletal muscle. So this is somatic. So somatic motor. Okay. It's conscious. We know that we're going to, flex our biceps. We know we're going to move our arm. We know we're going to move our toes or whatever. Okay. So this is skeletal muscle. It's somatic. It's conscious. Okay. Again, starts in the anterior horn. At this part here, you remember what that is? That's a synapse. It's the neuromuscular junction. And what gets released from the somatic motor neuron to the skeletal muscle, the motor end plate of the skeletal muscle? It's acetylcholine. Can I say that any more Southern-like? Ugh. Okay. Acetylcholine. Okay, that's right here. Okay. This is a stimulatory synapse. All right. If the acetylcholine's going from the somatic motor neuron over to the biceps muscle's going to contract. Okay. So that's somatic motor. And again, we're conscious of it, right? Okay. So that has to do with skeletal muscle. So what about down here? We've got these sensory stimuli coming from glands, organs, and smooth muscle. So we got to have some kind of motor response to match those. Okay. So this is what is or becomes, I'm going to make these 2 really different colors, pink and green. Okay. So this is where we have the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the motor system, just like the somatic motor system is the motor system that innervates skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system has neurons that will innervate glands, organs, and smooth muscle. All right, so here's what's different here. The autonomic nervous system neurons that go to the different viscera and that type of thing, this is a pathway, and it's a 2-neuron pathway. Looking above at the somatic, it was just 1 neuron. Started at the anterior horn, went all the way to the skeletal muscle. But autonomic neurons don't do that. So we have 2 neurons. So we have 1 neuron here, all right, and then it will synapse to another neuron. And then go to the effector, the organ, okay? There are 2 flavors of autonomic neurons. And again, they are both a 2-neuron pathway. Okay. So this one up here is sympathetic. So this is the sympathetic nervous system. This one down here is parasympathetic. All right, they look a little bit different, but they're both 2-neuron pathways. All right, so this first neuron in the pathway, this is called the preganglionic neuron. Let's put that here. So preganglionic neuron. So this one would be the postganglionic neuron. Easy enough. And down here in the parasympathetic, that first neuron, even though it's longer than this one up here, it's still the preganglionic neuron. And this one down here that is shorter is still the postganglionic neuron. So what does that mean? What is a ganglion? Well, you should know that a ganglion, just like the dorsal root ganglion over here, this ganglion over here is a collection of nerve cell bodies, okay? So this is where the synapse occurs. So this area here is a ganglion. So this neuron over here is the preganglionic neuron. It's the before the ganglion neuron. And this neuron here is the after the ganglion neuron, or postganglionic neuron. And of course, there's one down here as well. So that's where the synapse is. Okay. All right, so these are autonomic. Together, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic create the autonomic nervous system. So these neurons are going to innervate, again, glands, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, organs. Okay? Again, all the things that we don't have control over that just work on their own. Autonomous. Okay. So this is a ganglion, this is a ganglion, this is a synapse, this is a synapse between the two. If that first neuron fires, it's going to send a message, it is going to stimulate the second one. So the preganglionic neuron always stimulates the postganglionic neuron. There's no, having to really get to threshold. It's going to get to threshold. It's going to fire that one, okay? And in order to do that, of course, we have to have a neurotransmitter. This is a synapse, a chemical synapse. And that neurotransmitter is going to be is going to be acetylcholine. So that neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And it's the same here. Neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. Okay, and again, it's always going to be stimulatory. It's always going to fire that postganglionic neuron. Okay, that's just the way it is. Okay. So what about at the effector? So this area here is a synapse. This area here is a synapse. So there's going to be a neurotransmitter there. And guess what? It isn't acetylcholine. Okay. In this case, the neurotransmitter is going to be norepinephrine. So here's our little neurotransmitter. And it's going to be norepinephrine or epinephrine. So norepinephrine or epinephrine. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Gosh, I'm losing my mind. Just going on without even thinking. This is not norepinephrine. Sorry about that. I would start this over, but I've gone too far. So this one here is sympathetic. So sympathetic uses norepinephrine and epinephrine. Parasympathetic uses acetylcholine. But here's the thing. So I'm going to put acetylcholine down here. But here's the thing. At the neuromuscular junction and at the ganglion between the preganglionic nerve and the postganglionic nerve, that's always stimulatory, okay? Here, it's not always stimulatory, okay? So the function in here could be either stimulatory, or inhibitory. Remember up here, always stimulatory. So what makes that difference, whether something is stimulatory or inhibitory? I mean, acetylcholine is acetylcholine. It is just what it is. But its function depends on the receptor that it's binding to. So the receptor here at the ganglion and over here at the neuromuscular junction is always a stimulatory receptor. Here at the effectors of the autonomic nervous system, they can be stimulatory or inhibitory. Okay, so that means that this acetylcholine, the receptors are weird or different than the receptors over here. Okay, so we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay. All right, so that's the general setup. There is a adjunct function with the sympathetic nervous system. So we need to look at that really quick. So here's the sympathetic nervous system. And here's that first neuron, the preganglionic neuron. And notice that I'm doing the first neuron of the sympathetic short and the second one long. In the parasympathetics, the first one is long and the second one is short. That's significant. Okay. This particular preganglionic neuron goes to an actual organ. Good color, good brown. Do it orange. All right, so it goes to an organ called the adrenal gland. And there's a part of the adrenal gland that is neurological tissue. And that's the core, the center of it, called the medulla. And these preganglionic neurons go to the medulla, and again, this is a synapse, and it's going to secrete acetylcholine. It's going to be stimulatory. And in this instance, instead of another neuron being stimulated, it will dump epinephrine or norepinephrine into the blood. So epinephrine and norepinephrine can act as hormones. So they can act as neurotransmitters or they can act as a hormone. So if the sympathetics, and they generally will in a sympathetic response, that adrenal medulla will dump the norepinephrine into the blood, and it will systemically cause a sympathetic response. Okay, so instead of going just to one organ like this does, it'll go to all the organs. Norepinephrine will. Okay. All right, so looking at the nerves themselves, just to let you know this, let's use this color. The preganglionic neuron is myelinated, and it's lightly not myelinated. So it isn't like the motor neuron that's going to have a big old, this one's going to be like myelinated, right? Because this is a big motor neuron. But this one's going to be lightly myelinated, and the preganglionics are always lightly myelinated. The postganglionics are not myelinated at all. Okay, so that's going to become, it's not like that's majorly important, but when you see where they exit out of the spinal cord, especially within the thoracolumbar or the sympathetic part of the spinal cord, the fibers that exit are going to be white, and the fibers that go back out to the periphery, those postganglionic fibers, are going to be gray. That's why. Okay, so the last thing, this is a long video, so the last thing I want to mention are some things about these neurotransmitters. Okay. All right. So acetylcholine is called a cholinergic neurotransmitter. Okay, this is so since it is a cholinergic neurotransmitter, it binds to cholinergic receptors. And there are two flavors of cholinergic receptors. There are nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors are always stimulatory. So what's going to be here at the ganglion, between the preganglionic and the postganglionic? It's going to have, that postganglionic cell body is going to have nicotinic receptors. It's always going to be stimulatory. Down here at the synapse between the adrenal medulla and the preganglionic neuron, it's always going to be stimulatory. That medulla is going to have nicotinic receptors. Right down here in the parasympathetic, between the pre and the postganglionic neuron, always going to be stimulatory. So that postganglionic neuron is going to have nicotinic receptors. Right here at the neuromuscular junction, it's always stimulatory. The skeletal muscle is going to have nicotinic receptors on it. Okay, so what's a muscarinic receptor? Well, the muscarinic receptor isn't always stimulatory. It can be stimulatory or inhibitory. Okay, so this acetylcholine right here going to any of these things, depending on if it's stimulatory or inhibitory, it's going to, all these things are going to have muscarinic receptors, and that will let it know what it's going to be. So for example, the heart. Okay, acetylcholine, as we said, we know is stimulatory at the neuromuscular junction always. But on cardiac muscle at the heart, it is inhibitory. Acetylcholine slows heart rate. Okay, acetylcholine to effectors in the digestive tract, stimulate digestion, stimulate those organs. Okay, so acetylcholine is going to be one or the other depending on how the receptor, what the receptor is doing. Okay, so these are going to be muscarinic receptors that go with here. Okay, the sympathetic side is a little bit different. Sympathetics, so sympathetics use norepinephrine and epinephrine. These are adrenergic. Adrenergic neurotransmitters. Okay. There's two flavors of adrenergic receptors to bind there. There's beta, and then there's alpha. Okay, and again, those are going to be either stimulatory or inhibitory. So adrenergic receptors at the heart for norepinephrine speed up heart rate. Okay, adrenergic receptors in the digestive tract for norepinephrine slow down digestion, inhibit it. Okay, so these are adrenergic receptors, either alpha or beta. And these down here are muscarinic receptors for acetylcholine for the parasympathetic. Okay, that is a whole lot of information about the autonomic nervous system. But that's basically the whole thing in a nutshell. All right, so I may do another video and post it explaining more about these receptors. But overall, this is exactly how the entire nervous system, from sensory to motor, somatic, and then autonomic, all that is basically summed up here.